And is this, yeah, that advances. Can everybody hear me? Can everybody hear me okay? All right. Good afternoon. Thank you all for coming. Thank you for the invitation to be here. The work that I'm going to show today is just part of a 2-year project funded by a grant from the Historical Society as one of 20 research projects addressing the programmatic theme of religion and innovation in human affairs. After Burnham deals broadly with certain effects of religion upon urban form and makes conjectures about the possible future influence of religion upon the challenge of contemporary urban congestion, viewing and addressing these topics through the lens of Daniel Burnham's 1909 Plan of Chicago. The effects of religion upon urban form are here considered under 2 aspects. First, the multiple religious communities who make place in modern societies, including here the Notre Dame Graduate Urban Design Studio as an example of such a community. And second, the character of the places that modern societies make now and in the future. A word about Notre Dame. We are the only degree-offering architecture school in the country, perhaps in the world, that has classical architecture and urbanism as the foundation of its curriculum. And after Burnham represents the work of 2 Notre Dame Graduate Urban Design Studios in the fall of 2011 and the fall of 2012, as well as the work of selected alums of our Graduate Urban Design Studio. It's tempting to characterize our approach at Notre Dame as countercultural, but I'm going to refrain from such a characterization and say instead that our aspiration is that Notre Dame's approach to architecture and urbanism be Catholic, in both a large C and a small c sense. This aspiration is reflected in our consideration and embrace of both Catholic metaphysical realism and Catholic social teaching. In addition, we seek to learn and participate in an intellectual tradition with roots in both classical antiquity and biblical religion that views human well-being as the very purpose of cities and the apotheosis of creation itself as the city of God. At Notre Dame, we seek to learn and extend these understandings of the purpose of cities, and we operate with the assumption that urbanism is a complex thing, always and everywhere simultaneously an environmental order, a demographic order, an economic order, a moral order, and a formal order, all of which we as Catholic Christian teachers understand to exist within and sometimes to reveal an overarching context of sacred order. I was hoping to hear a laugh at this. Explicitly or not, these assumptions about architecture and cities and sacred order and human flourishing were shared by most human beings prior to the modern era. But among its revolutions, modernity also revolutionized architecture and cities. The success of modernity can be measured by dramatic increases in human mobility, lifespan, and per capita income wherever modern institutions have established themselves. But these successes come at a price. Powerful accounts abound of the suffering that modernity engenders as traditional societies become modern societies, and the modern view of nature as raw material for human purposes, which has resulted in both the potential and the reality of environmental catastrophes at unprecedented scale, has created wholly modern discontents. An additional critique views modernity as culturally unsustainable because of the individualist, therapeutic, consumerist character type that modern societies seem to mass produce. The long intellectual tradition of which Notre Dame sees itself as part views cities and character formation, and hence cities and human well-being, as intimately related. If true, this should give us pause. Ours is the time of what some call hypermodernism, a time of exploding urbanization in the modernizing societies of Asia, Africa, and South America, and time in the aftermath of almost 70 years of American suburbanization. Both modern megacities and suburban sprawl represent distinctively modern forms of human settlement, but neither is typically evaluated holistically with respect to the relationship of urban formal order to either environmentally or culturally sustainable human well-being. A primary reason for this is that questions about nature, cities, culture, and human well-being are also philosophical and religious questions that pertain to public and common goods. Such questions, let alone proposed answers to them, get little, if any, traction today because for many persons in the modern world, philosophical and religious questions are essentially private. Hypermodernist urbanism therefore proceeds apace, both its metaphysical assumptions and its own intrinsic nature remaining largely uncritiqued. On July 4th, 1909, at a moment when Chicago was both the fastest growing and most quintessentially modern city in the world, and the Chicago Cubs were reigning world champions, the last time that they were reigning world champions, the Commercial Club of Chicago published Daniel Burnham's Plan of Chicago. Justly praised to this day for its regional sensibilities and environmental prescience, it is often criticized for its allegedly autocratic social and design sensibilities. Less commonly noted, even by admirers, is that the Plan of Chicago was one of the last great efforts to employ classical principles of architectural, landscape, and urban design in and for and at the scale of a rapidly expanding modern industrial metropolitan region. This it did consciously participating in Western culture's long tradition, a metaphysical realist and sacramental tradition of humanist urbanism. In its centennial year of 2009, even Chicago commentators typically treated the Plan of Chicago as a historical document, the relevance of which had largely passed. In particular, there was a sense, rarely spoken but widely assumed, that in a world of hypermodern megacities, the relevance of humanist urbanism itself has passed. This assumption represents a challenge to the Notre Dame Graduate Urban Design Studio, and After Burnham is our response to that challenge. Taking the 1909 Plan of Chicago as an authoritative starting point, After Burnham seeks to demonstrate that classical humanist architecture and urbanism and Catholic social teaching together, better than modernism or hypermodernism, can locate the modern metropolis in both nature and sacred order in a manner practical, humane, symbolically legible, and beautiful for the sake of human flourishing in both time and eternity. In her classically informed approach to architecture and urbanism, Notre Dame at her best seeks all of the traditional Vitruvian virtues of durability, comfort, beauty, and decorum. But the extent to which Notre Dame's approach also addresses contemporary concerns for sustainability is often overlooked by our critics. And here I can give but a glimpse of how Our Lady's Plan of Chicago 2109 addresses issues of land use, transportation, water conservation and treatment, and polycentric urbanism, all in ways consonant with an ethic of environmental stewardship. This slide shows population growth and patterns of land occupation in metropolitan Chicago from the mid-1850s, with more than a quadrupling of land occupied between 1936 and 2009 for less than double the total population. Presuming a similar population in 2109, not, we think, steady, but following a pattern of depopulation and repopulation, Our Lady's Plan places virtually the same population on less than 30% of the land area of 2009 metropolitan Chicago. This slide shows Metro Chicago's 2109 population located primarily around existing and improved city and regional rail service, and how post-1945 sprawl has reverted back to farmland, prairie, and forest. This slide illustrates the increasingly frequent flooding problems in Metro Chicago caused by the combination of Chicago's impervious surfaces and reverse-engineered river system. And Our Lady's Plan's multi-front effort to recapture stormwater and sewage and return it as fresh water either to the ground or by a re-reversal of the Chicago River to Lake Michigan. This slide illustrates our proposed settlement types throughout metropolitan Chicago, ranging from rural hamlets and villages at local state and county crossroads at a density of 5,000 to 8,000 people per square mile, to urban neighborhoods in excess of 25,000 people per square mile. Incidentally, we believe that sprawl suburbs are certain to contract less from energy shortages than from current declining birth rates and the economic unsustainability of local sprawl infrastructure. This slide illustrates in green the interstate highway right-of-ways within the city limits of Chicago, and suggests how some of them may be re-urbanized and greened. Now, whatever disagreements may exist about the details of these several proposals and their implications for environmental sustainability, we suspect there will be fairly wide agreement about the objective of environmental sustainability, not least because Notre Dame's long-term view of the future is hopeful, and our short-term view of the future is merely pessimistic rather than apocalyptic. But there is another immediate issue about which there will not be broad agreement, and that has to do with the symbolic content of traditional architecture and traditional formal representations of the sacred. And it's to this subject that I want to devote the rest of my talk. Bess's first and second laws of architecture and urbanism state, first, architecture always symbolizes power and aspires to symbolize legitimate authority. Example, another example in the tradition of classical humanism. On the left, architecture as power aspiring to authority, a modernist version of that, and a hypermodernist on the left, and a hypermodernist version of that on the right. The second law of Bess's laws of architecture and urbanism state, a widespread desire for and expectation of social predictability from everyone else, the culture of bureaucracy, combined with a widespread desire for and expectation of maximum freedom for oneself, the culture of personal autonomy, will never produce a beautiful, coherent, and intelligible public realm. So, a couple of examples. Recognizing that all spirituality has a personal component, allow me to observe that an interest in personal spirituality today appears to increase in direct proportion to the disappearance of the sacred from the public realm and the decline of religious authority. Authority in the public realm today belongs not to the sacred, not even to the civic, but rather to corporate capital, to the bureaucratic state, and to the artist self-defined. Some will no doubt say that our religious and civic leaders have squandered their historic authority, that this explains the absence of great civic and religious buildings in the modern world, and that on the whole, this is a just and deserved situation. And yet, if the civic and the sacred cede the public realm to the corporation, the bureaucracy, and the artist, how will any of the latter ever be held to account? What becomes of justice when justice is simply that which is defined by those who hold power? In sacred order, the corrupt cleric is held to account, here or in eternity. In desacralized modernity, who holds the corrupt businessman or politician to account? I want to suggest that this concern for legitimate authority, the very idea of which implies sacred order, is implicit in the Plan of Chicago, and it is quite explicit in Our Lady's Plan of Chicago 2109. I hope it will be clear in what follows that this is not a special pleading for Catholicism or Christianity or religion generally. It's more aptly regarded as expressing the principle of subsidiarity, in which neither church nor state nor commerce dominate the public realm, but rather where each finds their rightful place suited to their proper realms of authority. Let me try to illustrate this quickly. Okay, so here's Chicago, the central business district, right around 1900. Go back. And this is the site where Daniel Burnham proposed to locate his city hall at Halsted and Congress, or what would become Congress, which is not shown here. So that's 1900. This is, the circle represents the central business district in Burnham's Plan of Chicago from 1909. And here was his strategy for reorienting the symbolic organization of Chicago. He placed he proposed another business district to the south side of Congress Street. This map, incidentally, is east-west up. So he proposed an extension of the business district to the south of Congress Street, and then proposed a city hall at the intersection of Halsted and Congress, thereby creating a civic axis and a kind of counterweight to the commercial center of Chicago, in which Congress Street becomes the new center of the city of Chicago. And this is what that looked like in the famous aerial rendering of Jules Guerin. and this is another famous Guerin rendering of Burnham's proposed City Hall and Plaza at Congress and Halsted. So what actually happened in post-1945 Metropolitan Chicago? What happened was freeways and sprawl. So this is a plan, this is Burnham's plan in 1909. This is the existing condition in 1966. And what happened where Burnham proposed a city hall at the intersection of Congress and Halsted, what actually happened was at Congress and Halsted was located the Chicago Circle interchange. And we get this great quote from a well-known history of Chicago. It's obvious to the student of Chicago today that a great deal of the plan has not commended itself to public attention, but many elements have become commonplace elements of the city. Among those features which have been implemented are the placing of the Chicago Circle, major focus of the city's expressway system, at a location originally designed by the plan as the Civic Center Plaza. So this is Chicago 2009, where I would characterize the symbolic content as the order of modern capital, except in Chicago it's the order of modern crony capital. And so that's what it looks like. So this is the plan of Chicago compared to Our Lady's, plan of Chicago of 1909 compared to Our Lady's plan of Chicago in 2109 for the central area, where we propose to locate City Hall at the same place, and where, and in the same location at the intersection of Congress and Halsted, where the supposition is that we've reclaimed the interstate right-of-way and restored that fabric and created this site for the City Hall. So where Burnham had a civic axis, we're proposing restoring the civic axis and creating a sacred axis. So I want to talk about, real quickly, sacred order and urban form in America and how we've formalized non-established and free exercise those ideas in American life. So these are examples of different ways we've done that. This is Jackson Square of New Orleans with the Cathedral of St. Louis. It's a centralized square. Its relationship to the church is formal. It's singular. It's one church. This is New Haven, Connecticut, where, again, you have a centralized square and a formal relationship, but here not between one church but three churches. So it's centralized, formal, and plural. This is a centralized and informal plural relationship in Evanston, Illinois, where you have a centralized square and 5 churches that are arranged around it in a kind of ad hoc way. In Savannah, Georgia, you have, in some ways, to my way of thinking, the best diagram of church-state relations in the U.S., where you've got centralized squares, except a polycentric condition, which is formal and plural in the relationship of the churches to the squares. There are 11, I think 11 of the 23 squares have religious buildings that front them. And then you have the linear circumstance, both the scale of the small town and at a bigger scale as well. This is Port Gibson, Mississippi. It's Highway 61, where as you come into town from Highway 61, within a stretch of a half a mile, you have 8 churches located along Highway 61. And then here's that phenomenon at a larger scale. We all know Washington, D.C., and its major axis to the Potomac and the cross-axis and the sites that were, that existed nascently in the L'Enfant plan and then were added to and extended by the Macmillan plan of 1901 that Daniel Burnham was also involved in. But those axes also, one of those axes extends to the north along 16th Street, where you get this condition. You get approximately, in 4 miles, you get approximately 30 religious buildings that are located on 16th Street, which is on this axis, right? And there's the White House, and here's 16th Street. You can't see all those churches, but you can see the dots there. And so you get 29 churches or 30 churches on 16th Street. So another example of a linear, informal, plural manifestation of religious buildings in public life. And even in Chicago in 1857, before it became overwhelmed by commerce, was organized this way, where you had the site of City Hall, and it was flanked by 2 churches in a formal relationship, and then eventually there was a development of churches along what is today Wabash Avenue, but then was known informally as Church Street. But as I say, all of that got overwhelmed by commerce in the second half of the 19th century. And here's that relationship with public square, church, church, public square, church, church, and then various churches off in this direction that are shown here. This is from Daniel Bluestone's book. I'm blanking on the title. So civic order and sacred order in Chicago. This is Our Lady's Plan of Chicago take on this and what inspired it. So whereas Burnham proposed a civic axis, we're proposing to reestablish the civic axis and establish a sacred axis. And what is that sacred axis? Well, it's located in that zone right there, the green zone right there. And the question was, what's the content, what's the scale, what's the character? Well, the content is the multiplicity of religious communities that exist within Chicago. So we're imagining. What's illustrated here are a mosque and a Hindu temple and a Buddhist temple and the Mormon temple and a Greek Orthodox church and a Protestant church and a Catholic church and a synagogue. So we imagine that these would occupy that sacred axis. Here were a series of studies that we did that looked at the sacred axis and whether it was something that would be continuous or something that would be discontinuous. There were disagreements on the design team. I ultimately opted for the continuous axis, and we can talk about that afterwards if you're interested. This is a comparison, a scalar comparison between the sacred axis right here. The distance from here to there is 1.2 miles. This is Randolph Street. This is Roosevelt Road for those of you that know Chicago. And so it's comparable to Savannah along Bull Street, the extension of Bull Street through the squares and then down through Forsyth Park. This is Commonwealth Avenue, the mile-long stretch of Commonwealth Avenue right here. This is Washington, D.C. from the Capitol building to the Washington Monument. And this is Paris from the Louvre to the Arc de Triomphe, all at the same scale. So this is an enlargement of that area shown there. This is a comparison of our space to the Washington Mall, Grant Park, to Central Park in New York, and again to Paris and the Champs-Élysées. This is the east elevation of our proposed Chicago City Hall with a church and a synagogue located, but this is just a short little version of the 1.2 miles. This is a perspective of the City Hall on the civic axis. Here's a perspective looking north on the sacred axis. This is an aerial perspective of the sacred axis at the south end, the detail of that. This is an aerial perspective detail of the crossing between the sacred and the civic axis. This is an aerial perspective of the entire sacred axis. We have to stop?
Yeah.
I'll stop.